Good evening. I have to say, first of all, reading Information Wars, your book, is just fascinating. There are so many stories about times that we thought we knew about, and we get a lot of background. But then I actually was really excited about the part at the end where you talk about solutions. And one of the questions about or your thought that there should be media literacy and also civic literacy. And I say this as someone who goes up and introduces myself as being from Minnesota Public Radio and holding my microphone in front of people's faces, and they say, "That's very small for a camera, isn't it?" And which happens a ridiculous amount of time. But what form does that take? Learning, I mean, is this something that should be taught in schools? Is this something we should just be talking about all the time?
So Mark mentioned that I ran the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, a really fabulous place. And one of the great moments was I put Sandra Day O'Connor on the board. And Sandra Day O'Connor is just a spectacular woman. I mean, she was in I think she's in the Colorado Cowgirl Hall of Fame. And I remember her saying to me one day, she said, "Mr. Stengel, we're going to pay a terrible price in this country for having stopped teaching civics 50 years ago." And we used to joke about, oh boy, I have to go to this class on how a bill becomes a law. And again, it wasn't the most exciting thing, but I'm not sure we would have elected a candidate for office who didn't know there were three branches of government, and may still not know there are three branches of government. An educated electorate is absolutely indispensable for democracy. And by the way, the framers knew that better than anybody. So yes, I would argue that we need to teach civic literacy, digital literacy, media literacy in schools, and start early. I mean, by the way, they should be teaching computer programming in schools. I mean, we have to move with the times. And one of the things that my pal Walter Isaacson said in his book about Benjamin Franklin, that one institution Franklin could come back to contemporary America and recognize is elementary school. That's not a good thing, but.
I wanted to ask about something else too, and that is, I was lucky enough recently to meet Daniel J. Jones, who is an FBI investigator who was the gentleman who spent several years in the bunker going through the documents about the CIA torture program. Mm-hmm. And he produced this huge report, which then became subject of a lot of internal politicking during the Obama administration as to whether or not it would be released, and it was finally released in a heavily redacted form. So this was essentially 7 years of his life working towards getting out the truth. And he said that finally, this heavily redacted document went out, and it was on the front page of every single, reputable news publication in the world, but the day after it was gone. And I wonder sometimes that part of our problem is the news cycle is going so fast, and there are actually a lot of people within politics, within government, within international relations who depend on that.
Mm-hmm. So, I'm sorry. Have you not been hearing me? I've gotten lazy with the microphone. Yes, the news cycle has sped up. I mean, it's sad that a story that someone had worked on for years and years was only a one-day story. But I'm also a little bit skeptical about this idea that technological change is changing everything. So when I became editor of Time, I did some research into the history of how Time started. Henry Luce started it, and it was started in 1923, and part of the reason he started this News Digest was that there were 26 daily newspapers in New York City in 1923, and he felt people were overwhelmed with information. They couldn't process all the information. They needed one kind of digest. So throughout our history, technological change has been bemoaned. I mean, Plato worried that writing would ruin people's memory. So,
I don't think he was right. Maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm a little skeptical that that we can't absorb all of this. I think the problem with civilization, not to put too fine a point on it, is that technology is evolving very fast, and we humans are not evolving at all. That's the big problem.
We'll get right on that. But what a technology question here from the audience. Would you explain bots?
Yeah, so bots are machines. They're not humans, and they are, there's a kind of a formula, an algorithm to create a bot, and the Russians are very good at it. But by the way, you know who else is good at it? Big Procter & Gamble and big companies that are trying to get you to buy consumer products. So what they do is bots will retweet things. They will, if you ever get on Facebook or on Twitter a request from someone who doesn't seem real, I do all the time, it's probably a bot. And one of the things that I suggest is that the platform companies need to tell you when something is not human and when something is human. You can be deceived by a human being too, but I'd like to know when I'm being deceived by a machine rather than a human being.
We had an interesting story actually last week on our air about how even before President Trump began his campaign against Ilhan Omar, there were some 90,000 tweets about her. And there was an academic did a study of this and went and actually looked for the source and found that about half of these tweets were actually filled with Islamophobic claims. But the vast majority of them had actually only come from 5 people. But they had been sent out and then the bots had then had actually expanded upon them so that they quickly became 90,000 tweets.
Yes, there's a hierarchy. I talked about countering ISIS. So I remember we estimated at one point there were 5,000 to 10,000 what we call digital jihadis, mostly in Iraq and Syria, and they would get tremendous traffic for what they did, in part because they would all retweet each other, and they also had bots doing that. And I think there's just a lot of nefarious folks out there, and there's a lot of artificiality in the internet. So part of the problem with the way all these companies work is that the great goal is virality, right? Everybody benefits from that. The platform companies get more viewers, they get more advertising. The people who create viral content actually can make a lot of money from it. That was the story about the Macedonian teenagers during the election who created Hillary Clinton sites and Trump sites, and the Trump sites, which was filled with misinformation and disinformation, got tremendous amount of traffic. And again, whatever the rate they get, penny per click, Google the way the Google ads work is that you get paid for virality because people are advertising on your site. So one of the things I talk about as a time up. What was that?
No, that's just a ping.
Is that that when I was a young journalist, even when I was editor of Time, there was still interaction between advertisers and brands. I would have to take out advertisers and have a martini at lunch and try to persuade them to advertise in Time. They knew if they were advertising in Time, they were getting fact-checked content, reliable content by experts and journalists. But on the web now, the vast lion's share of advertising is automated advertising. What does that mean? You're buying a cohort, a category. You're not buying a brand. So there's no interaction between human beings when you buy ads on Facebook or Google. But here's what happens. So if you're selling sneakers and you want to reach young men between 18 and 24 who like the NBA, you can program your ad to reach them. Google will help you do that. Facebook will help you do that. But what do young men between 18 and 24 look at on the internet? A lot of nasty stuff. So a sneaker company complains like, well, my ad is on this conspiracy site, or my ad is next to pornography, or my ad is next to this violent site. Well, when advertising is de-linked from brands, what that does is it helps create a rise of disinformation and virality. I don't have a great solution for it, but part of the way the world has changed has optimized disinformation.
It's a great question following on from that. Can you provide examples of how other countries have responded to disinformation and lack of transparency of who is pushing ads or pushing content on the internet or social media, and were any of those countries successful?
So the best example, and the folks who are most out front about this, is the European Union, the EU GDR, and they have created very strict guidelines about advertising, about hate speech, and a lot of the American platform companies are both guided by that and looking for that. But I do want to make a point about what's allowable and what's not allowable. And the First Amendment applies to government censorship. The first 5 words of the First Amendment is Congress shall make no law. The First Amendment does not apply in the same way to private entities. It doesn't apply in the same way to Facebook and Google as it does to the U.S. government. By the way, Facebook and Google have their own constitutions. It's called terms of service agreements. Nobody has ever read a whole term of service agreement. But if you do read it, you see content that they say that they will take off if you do it. And by the way, they will take off hate speech. I mean, they say it's not allowed. The reason they don't take it off is because they have immunity from any liability if they don't take it off. And so their terms of service says it's not allowed, but they don't take it off because they have immunity. That's why the Communications and Decency Act, Section 230, needs to be amended.
So many questions here. As Twitter gets ready to announce more details on banning of political ads that mention candidates, do you think this will have any impact or will lead to a broader conversation during the needed broader conversation during the election?
So I thought it was bold of Twitter to say they're not going to take political ads. I find philosophically that I have a problem with it because for a variety of reasons. One, we're a democracy. Our whole system is based on people making a judgment about political candidates, and one way we do that is through advertising, even advertising that's deceptive. I want people to be able to make those decisions, and Lord knows, if Americans are sophisticated about something, it should be commercials. We've seen so many of them. At the same time, political advertising on social media helps minority candidates, helps the little guy, helps David against Goliath. You can have ads on Facebook or Google. That helps you win. It helps good guys as well as bad guys. And so I think it's a difficult decision taking up political ads. The one distinction I would make, political ads are political speech, and political speech is more privileged speech than regular speech for good reason. There's a whole 100 years of constitutional law about that. What I think the distinction I would make, and I actually saw today that Joe Biden said something like this, is that I wouldn't take down political ads, but political ads that contain demonstrably, provably false statements should be taken down. That's not an easy thing to decide, and one of the things that Mark Zuckerberg said is, do you want Facebook making those decisions? And I guess I don't. But I think it's a complicated issue, and I think the world wouldn't necessarily be a better place if all the platform companies took off political ads.
Following on from that, we have an election. You may have heard there's an election coming up. What, in terms of the disinformation and the tactics used, I mean, what's your prediction as to what's likely to happen? Will we see more of the same?
Well, One of the things, again, if folks are paying attention, so the Senate Intelligence Committee, which has issued 2 really excellent bipartisan reports about disinformation. In the recent one that came out just a few weeks ago, they pointed out a number of things that were new to me and alarming, including the fact that the Russians have done more in our election space since 2016 than they did before 2016. They too have become more sophisticated. There are new evolving technologies like deep fakes, which are very, very dangerous and very hard to combat. So I think it's going to be a kind of ugly free-for-all, and of course, you have the President of the United States, who is the disinformationist in chief, who seems to not care at all about any kind of fidelity to fact. So I can't imagine that his campaign is going to be at all squeamish about that. So I think it's going to be a pretty wild ride.
So everyone should read very carefully.
Well, I mean, the good news is that we're talking about it and that people are more aware of it. And, most Americans were not. And most Americans were not at all skeptical about the content that they got. And I think most, Americans probably are more skeptical and more wary, and that's the first line of defense.
Another question from the audience. We've talked a lot about Russia. What is China doing?
So, good question. And some of my information is a little bit out of date because it's from 2016 when I was in government. But the Chinese are the most adept at stealing and hacking databases that have information, so that the hack of the Office of Personnel Management, where information about 14 million Americans was stolen. That was done by the Chinese in 2014. The Chinese are masters also of stealing intellectual property. They don't adhere to intellectual property guidelines. That being said, and that's at the harder end of the kind of information war, they're not yet really out there putting disinformation in our system about things that are going on in America, or even about themselves. There have been some recent reports that they have been doing sort of internet research agency type stuff around the protests in Hong Kong. That's a little bit scary, but as far as I know, and I don't have completely up-to-date information, they're not here doing the same things as the Russians with disinformation. They're doing other bad things, but not that.
And there is the question about pressure being put on U.S. companies that want to work in China too, though that's maybe not the disinformation.
Yes, that's a whole other area, including these crazy tariffs and all of that. So we won't get bogged down.
Yeah, we could be here all night. There are pushes of establishing personal data security as a human right. Do you believe this is a positive step to have ownership of personal data?
Yes, absolutely. It's your data. You should own it. These companies are making billions of dollars with your data. They're selling it. So I think there needs to be a privacy bill of rights. I think, when we'll look back decades from now, it will seem we're in a primitive time where people didn't own their information. I mean, your information is valuable, and you should own it. You should decide what to do with it. And there are lots of interesting companies that are now trying to become brokers of information. Yes, I mean that would also get in the way of a lot of this nasty stuff that's out there. Particularly if you say you cannot use any of my data to target me with any kind of advertising whatsoever. I mean, that would change the economic equation of these companies. That's their lifeblood.
You mentioned the idea about publishers and the control of the platforms. I'd actually like to kind of squish together a couple of questions here. How do we need to deal with Facebook through legislation or otherwise? And then what should be done with the quote disinformation from Fox News?
Okay, those are two different questions.
Very different questions, yes.
Let's take the former first. So one of the things I do write about in the book, in this battle against ISIS's disinformation, is actually how effective the platform companies were in fighting ISIS disinformation and ISIS propaganda. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars. They hired hundreds of Arabic speakers. They consulted with the government about it. They didn't want this on their system. They did an excellent job, and I praised them in the book, specifically Facebook. On the Russian stuff, not so much. I don't know how much Facebook saw. I assume they missed a lot of it also because it was hidden in plain sight. I mean, why would anyone know that Tennessee GOP wasn't a bunch of Republican women? I mean, one of the scary things for 2020 now is that the Russians are also kind of renting people's Facebook handles, not creating them out of whole cloth and even buying time on American servers, which they did, but actually using legitimate, names of people. I've now forgotten. But again, I do think making Facebook and all of the platform companies more liable for this content, for disinformation, false content, et cetera, would have a long-term effect. Fox News. One of the things that's interesting that I've been reading about, and tomorrow, I guess, is the first day of the actual public hearings of the impeachment inquiry investigation. I hear people people on the right say, well, if Fox News had existed when Richard Nixon was president, he never would have been impeached and he wasn't convicted, he resigned. I do think that Fox News as a kind of a pro-Trump entity is dangerous and something new in our republic. At the same time, they have lots and lots of journalists there who care about good journalism, who are doing good journalism about other things. And insofar as news organizations, particularly on cable, have become more skewed towards opinion rather than reporting and pure fact-based stuff, I do think that is dangerous for the republic. I am one of those people opining all the time, but I do also miss the days of kind of more traditional objective journalism, of which there's plenty to find. But I do think Fox is on this kind of normative continuum we have, and I think there's a danger in ostracizing people who are still trying, on many occasions to report the news, whatever that means. So.
How do we hold...
When I don't want them to hear me, I let them...
Yeah. How do we hold established news agencies to account when they run false stories or actively push disinformation? And I suppose, an accusation has been leveled at almost every news organization at some point.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, a traditional news organization that is a publisher, when I was editor of Time magazine, if we published false material, defamatory material, we could be sued. We were sued all the time, as any news organization is. We printed retractions when there were falsehoods. None of that applies to the platform companies because they're not considered publishers in the way that traditional publishers are. Now, if Facebook had to print a retraction for everything that's false on Facebook, I mean, that would become even bigger than Facebook. So I'm not saying they're have to be liable in the same way that Time magazine is liable. But traditional news organizations, and this is part of media literacy, I mean, they can't print or promulgate disinformation. I mean, that isn't protected by the First Amendment. You can be sued, and they do. They get sued all the time.
Although it has to be said, it's a tough process, suing. I mean, it can take a long, long time, and you're not really guaranteed of necessarily getting...
But also, I mean, good faith news organizations, if someone exposes something, another news organization that actually, in this story that you wrote, it's false that the State Department did X or Y, I mean, news organizations print retractions every day. Now, part of the problem is they don't get as much attention as the original mistake. But I mean, and online you can look up the retractions that the New York Times prints every day, or the Washington Post, or any paper.
Can make fun reading sometimes.
Yes, yes. I mean, but that's also the advantage that the disinformationists have. It's why it's asymmetric warfare. They don't print retractions. They don't have to check their stories. They don't have to research their stories. That's why you can be so fast. So that's the handicap that traditional news organizations have as well.
We have always been a country of different points of view. The difference today seems to be our loss of respect, and we're very divisive. Can we return to civil conversation?
I hope so. It does seem, well, that does sound better. It does, it seems far away. One of the underpinnings of the First Amendment is this idea of the marketplace of ideas. It came from John Milton and Enlightenment thinkers, and it was believed in by the framers. And the marketplace of ideas is this idea that the truth will win out over falsehood. I mean, there's a Thomas Jefferson letter in the free interplay of ideas. If the truth is allowed to speak, it will always win out. So, they were men of the Enlightenment. They believed in something called reason, which I'm not sure I believe in. But one of the things that I argue, because of social media, that the marketplace of ideas is kind of broken. This idea that truth or factual material will overwhelm falsehood is kind of proven wrong every day, where every study shows that the most alarmist and sensational content is the content that becomes the most viral. So I worry a little bit about the playing field. It's not level, and I worry about the loss of civility, where the loudest voices are the ones that are most heard.
You write in your book, in Information Wars, about the transition you made from being a journalist, and actually a very quick transition you made from then going into becoming a diplomat. And it looks like you had a lot of fun, although some pretty rotten days too. Do you see yourself ever doing that again?
Which?
I suppose either. But going back into government in some way.
So a friend of mine who's a foreign policy scholar said to me about my book, he said, it's not the best foreign policy book ever written, it's the funniest foreign policy book ever written. I have to say, as critical as I am of the bureaucracy, I loved public service. I loved working in government. I loved, as somebody put it, standing behind the flag. I always felt like, for better or for worse, and we made mistakes, that we were always trying to do the right thing. I remember, I'd spent my lifetime kind of covering things like this, and then suddenly I was in meetings with foreign officials, with President Obama and with Secretary Kerry, and I would hear them say these things that they were actually saying in public, where they would talk to the Chinese about human rights and about repressing free speech. And this was in small meetings, and it made me super proud. And it made me proud to be doing that same thing. And I saw that over and over. And one of the things that's dispiriting about the current administration is that these ideas, these are idealistic ideas that we would actually speak about in these meetings with foreign leaders and heads of state and foreign ministers. I'm not so sure we're doing that anymore. I mean, I remember actually an African foreign minister saying to me, somewhat jokingly, you come and talk to me about human rights and transparency, and the Chinese come and build me a superhighway. Who am I going to listen to? Well, I'm proud that we talk about human rights and transparency, that we're not completely transactional. We have an administration that actually doesn't understand the values piece and only understands the transaction piece.
What's your opinion about Snowden? I assume this is not Princess Anne's former husband, but...
was Princess Margaret's former husband.
You're right. I apologize. Well, that's me never going back. Okay, right.
Disinformation.
Yeah.
That was misinformation.
Yeah, it was misinformation, yeah. I did that deliberately so we'd have a...
I knew that because I went to graduate school in England at Oxford, and my college, Christ Church, had a dinner once for Princess Margaret, and I think there were 40 grad students. 38 of them were English grad students. So there were 2 Americans, me and my buddy, and we were the only 2 people who were not invited to the Princess Margaret dinner. So not saying there was any prejudice.
No, not at all.
You know, I, to be honest, and you asked me a question about going from journalism into government, I had a different view of Snowden before I went into government. And you know, in this era where we're talking a lot about whistleblowers, what I realized in government is that he imperiled the lives of many people who were risking their lives for the American public, who took an oath of office to defend the Constitution. And I think there are better ways to do what he did without jeopardizing the safety of people who are risking their lives for all of us.
Let's see if I can read this. Granted, it doesn't seem the current administration is interested, but could there be deterrence in our own intelligence agencies waging disinformation on the Russians?
Well, and again, this is actually would be an actual classified discussion, but we don't do that. And believe me, it's something that got talked about in government. Should we respond the same way? I talked a little bit about how countering. Should we set up an internet research agency of our own? After all, these are our platforms, but nobody was for that. We don't do that. The intelligence services are not creating disinformation to counter Russian disinformation. And I'm proud of that, because when we do back to them what they do to us, we become them, and that is the difference ultimately. Again, I'm not saying that you know that the U.S. have been angels on the world stage always, but I have to tell you, in those rooms where serious people are making serious decisions, we decide to not play that same game that they do. Now, there are some reasonable people who say that we should, and of course during the Cold War we did that with public diplomacy, with why we fight and things like that. But to me, those were honest depictions of America that were telling America's story that people didn't necessarily know. And no, we don't respond to disinformation with disinformation.
Okay, there's a question here that obviously has a point of view, but after an administration that has promoted disinformation and has had agencies remove information from public access, such as about climate change data, how can we rebuild trust in our institutions?
I think it's very hard. And again, as I mentioned, the Russians and the disinformationists not only want us to maybe believe the falsehood, but believe that there is no truth. You know, this wacky philosopher that Trump, quoted a couple of times during the campaign, who was close to Putin, Alexander Dugin, has famously said the only truth is that there is no truth. That's the Russian way, and I do think it's going to take a long time for America to have credibility on these issues again, including climate change, and that's a difficult thing.
I don't know, maybe this is a yes-no question. Does Russia have something on Trump that makes him favor Russia?
I don't know.
That was 3 words, I know. How do you recommend young people prepare for a career in the Foreign Service? Can you be specific as how they should build and maintain a strong moral compass?
Yes, I think I am a big fan of the Foreign Service. If anyone here is thinking of taking the Foreign Service exam, I would recommend it. I think it has to evolve and come into the 21st century. But as we've seen over the last few weeks with a number of career Foreign Service officers, career ambassadors who have certainly risked their careers, risked their lives even, to come forward in opposition to the State Department telling them not to testify, answering subpoenas, that the moral compass of the Foreign Service, for the most part, is bending in the right direction. I think, again, in my experience working with hundreds or thousands of Foreign Service officers, I never knew what political affiliation they had or whether they had any political affiliation. The overwhelming number of them were absolutely there for the right reasons, as we've seen with the Foreign Service officers testifying. They work for the American people. They don't work for any particular administration. I was a political person. They saw me, people like me come and go. The Foreign Service abideth forever. And they believed in the oath that they took to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The only thing I would change is I would bring them more into the modern era. Have people be on social media, have other types of expertise than some of the traditional expertise. But the training they get, they're there for the right reasons. They're patriotic Americans.
We just have time for one more question, and I get to ask it.
Okay.
So, at the end of the book, you have a sentence: "If information is power, disinformation is an abuse of power," which seems like it's a very simple, but boy, that opens such a chasm. What do you mean by that?
So I talked about the framers' view of information. There's a famous passage from Madison in the Federalist Papers where he said, "A popular government without popular information is a prelude to a farce or a tragedy or both." I don't know which one we're living in now. But it's this idea that, to them, that democracies exist and function with the use of information and facts. That's how people make their judgment. In the Declaration, governments are formed among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. How is the consent of the governed arrived at? It's through information. That's how democracies work. So I actually think when someone abuses the truth, they're abusing their public trust. They're abusing the voters and the people who have to make decisions about who should govern. And so, to me, it's a serious crime. It's a high crime and misdemeanor, and depending on who it's practiced by. So, disinformation does undermine democracy, and that's why we have to become as vigilant as we can in trying to get rid of it and trying to put out truthful, fact-checked narratives.
Richard Stengel, thank you.